Humans have always looked to the skies, looking for ways to enhance their own existence and explore the world with a bird's-eye view. Flying machines go even further back than Leonardo Da Vinci's drawings. And whether people have been trying to recreate the motions of a bird's wings, glide, or float in a hot air balloon, it's safe to say that the world of aviation has come a long way since the likes of the Wright Brothers. Let us take a look at the top 15 most dangerous vintage flying machines. Number 15. The Wright Flyer. How could something so revolutionary and something that changed the course of humanity forever be included on a list of the most dangerous flying machines? Well, that's a fair question to ask, but if you really think about it, the Wright Flyer by today's standards doesn't quite make the cut in terms of safety. You can give the Wright brothers credit where it's due, but you would be a fool to hop into their Wright Flyer. The famous Brothers aircraft made its first historic flight back in 1903, and it's a marvel of modern aviation, and was the first powered machine to make a controlled and sustained flight with a pilot on board. Barely. The Wright Flyer couldn't even last a minute in the air, with a maximum flight time of 59 seconds, and it was pretty difficult for the pilot to navigate safely. In fact, it's amazing that they were able to make it into the air, fly, and then land without crashing. The Wright Flyer was also only ever able to cover a distance of 852 feet, meaning you're not going very far. Today, it is fair to say that the Wright Flyer proved to the world that humans could in fact fly. But the aircraft and the momentous event perhaps served better as a jumping-off point for what we could do. Number 14. The Blackburn Rock. Aircraft have certainly played their role in the military over the last decade, with many new and improved models turning the tides of battle. But for every successful new military aircraft, there are countless more that were completely scrapped. And the Blackburn Rock was one of those aircrafts that will never see the light of day again. Originally manufactured for the Royal Navy during World War II, the concept for the Blackburn Rock was very simple. Plop the machine gun right behind the pilot so the gunner could fly behind another fleet and defend them from the enemies in the rear. It should make perfect sense on paper, but in reality the idea backfired tragically. The machine gun was far too heavy. The excessive weight piled on with the placement on the craft slowed the plane down exponentially, which made it about as useful as a sitting duck on the battlefield, and not the kind of aircraft that you'd want to be in when things get hairy. All in all, the Blackburn Rock managed to shoot down just one enemy aircraft during World War II, proving that it was far more dangerous for those stuck inside it than it was for the enemy. Number 13. Royal Aircraft BE9. The Blackburn Rock wasn't the only aircraft to come from Great Britain during wartime. World War I changed the course of not just human history, but engineering as well. It was the first time the world powers had taken to the skies with monoplanes, biplanes, triplanes, and aircrafts with engine and propeller mounted in the rear. It was important to be able to go bigger and better than the enemy, and that's exactly what the Royal Aircraft Factory at least attempted to do with the BE9. They tried taking things to the next level by separating the front gunner from the pilot, pitting the engine and the propeller in between them. This new layout gave the BE9's gunner a full view of the battlefield, which was a major step forward in military aviation, but also 2 steps back in terms of safety, because they can either be crushed by the engine or ripped to ribbons by the propeller blades. A Royal British Air Force commander in the Battle of Britain took one look at the BE9 and stated the obvious, that it was too dangerous of an aircraft from the passenger's point of view. So if you're flying in the BE9, not only are you worried about being shot down, but you're also worried about being taken out by your own aircraft. Number 12. Messerschmitt Me-163. As World War II came to a close, Germany and the Third Reich knew that the beginning of the end had commenced. The regime wasn't one to back down from a fight just yet, and so desperate times called for desperate measures. They had created 2 aircraft in hopes to turn the tides of war in their favor, but their attempts were made in vain. One of these aircraft, and easily the worst, is the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet. This massive and dangerous aviation failure was a rocket-powered interceptor developed specifically to shoot down Allied heavy bombers en route to raid Germany. The Comet flew a whopping 100 miles an hour faster than any Allied fighter plane, but the catch here is it only had 3 minutes worth of fuel, meaning that even a successful run could mean a one-way trip. So once those 3 minutes were up, it was up to the pilot to glide back to base and hope for the best. If wind and weather conditions weren't just right, you were done for. And if Allied fighters were hot on your tail, you could forget about it. And then if you did make it back to the base in one piece, refueling was its own beast. The Me-163 Comet could only run on T-Stoff, an incredibly volatile oxidizing agent that would easily combust when it came into contact with clothing or leather. Any aircraft that could explode before you even make it into the air is definitely a dangerous one. Number 11. AD Scout. You may not be too worried about flying in a fighter plane that's been nicknamed something like the Hawk or the Falcon, but what if the plane was called the Sparrow? Well, maybe not so much. But that was the unfortunate nickname for the AD Scout, another dangerous vintage aircraft manufactured by Blackburn for the Royal Navy Air Service at the beginning of World War I. The AD Scout was designed to be an anti-airship fighter, primarily for naval use with a conventional wood and fabric construction. It was lightweight and only required one person to act as both the pilot and the gunner. But what set the AD Scout apart was that its fuselage was attached to the top wing instead of the bottom. This was also its downfall. While the strange placing of the fuselage gave the pilot-gunner a well-rounded view of the sky around him, it threw the entire craft off balance. But even if the pilot/gunner could get their AD Scout off the ground and flying in a straight line, one well-placed round from any enemy aircraft spelled a quick disaster for the pilot. And because it was a one-man craft, this meant that the pilot needed to also be able to aim, shoot, and reload his mounted gun, all while navigating the aircraft through a dogfight. Needless to say, the cockpit of the AD Scout was one of the worst places to be during the onset of the war to end all wars, which is why the project was scrapped just after one very unsuccessful month. Number 10. Curtiss Goupil Duck. While birds are the animals that inspired humans to attempt flight, it doesn't necessarily mean that we should literally try to recreate the shapes of their bodies when designing an aircraft. But Glenn Curtiss wasn't really willing to accept that advice when he uncovered the plans for what would become his Curtiss Goupil Duck. Originally designed by Alexander Goupil in 1883, the Curtiss Goupil Duck didn't see its first successful flight until 1917. This ugly duckling did actually look just like a duck, and it was built with a 3-axis control system, complete with flapping wings. But Curtiss didn't create the plane for the sake of humanity. Instead, he built it out of spite towards his rivals, the Wright Brothers, who had patented that same exact 3-axis control system. But Curtiss insisted that they didn't own the patent for his flapping aileron-like wings. But putting grudges aside, the Curtiss Goupil Duck was much more like the Wright Flyer in that it was too clunky to maneuver and even more difficult to get off the ground and break back down safely. Flapping wings really are for the birds. Number 9. Brewster Buffalo. The Brewster Buffalo entered the fray of World War II as the United States Navy's first monoplane aviary fighter and managed to leave behind a rather sordid legacy. Everyone hated it. The Brewster Buffalo may have looked cool, but when the pilot got in the cockpit, it became an entirely new beast. In terms of flying and navigation, it was dangerously unpredictable and tough to maneuver because it was so overweight. It was also incredibly so with the onset of the aircraft like the British Spitfire and the Japanese Ki-84. It was a relic during its own time, and picking them off was like shooting fish in a barrel for the Axis aircraft. And even if the pilot did manage to return to base after an aerial battle, the landing gear would often completely collapse during the landing, which often ended in the pilot's death during the landing. This gave the Brewster Buffalo the unfortunate nickname of the Flying Coffin, and was an aircraft that even ace pilots steered clear of. Number 8. Blackburn Botha. Here we go again with another dangerous entry brought to you by the folks at Blackburn. The Blackburn Botha is just another poor vintage design for a 2-engine aircraft that doubled as a torpedo bomber and reconnaissance plane. First and foremost, the Botha required 4 crew members to operate. That many people on board simply weighed the plane down, and its overall lack of power made carrying the torpedoes a task in and of itself, and firing them properly was nearly impossible. This also made the Botha tough to fly, and if it wasn't shot down by Axis fighters, then it was most likely getting into a fatal accident. When it came to serving as a simple reconnaissance craft, the Botha was failing miserably on that front too. The view from the cockpit was so horrendous that it was quickly deemed useless in terms of intelligence gathering, making this vintage aircraft a massive and dangerous failure in every possible way. It's quite possible that the Blackburn was so focused on the end goal of winning the war that they somehow forgot to keep pilots safe. Number 7. Hindenburg. The German passenger airship LZ-129 Hindenburg, more commonly known simply as the Hindenburg, is one of the most famous aviation tragedies in history. The use of airships was on the rise, being used for both commercial and wartime purposes, but the 1937 incident quickly put an end to what was known as the airship era. The flight was finishing up its final leg, coming from Germany and getting ready to moor in New Jersey. All was well until the rear of the ship burst into flames and spread to the nose before the entire craft crashed to the ground. So what exactly caused the Hindenburg to become engulfed in flames so quickly and so suddenly? Well, the craft's core was filled with hydrogen, which is an incredibly flammable gas, and a very small spark likely is what started the fire. But because hydrogen is so combustible, the entire hull of the Hindenburg caught in seconds and fell 200 feet. Of the 97 people on board, 35 died that day. And perhaps making matters worse is the entire event was caught on film and televised for the world to see. The Hindenburg tragedy taught world leaders and engineers alike that when it comes to creating an aircraft, including a hydrogen core is one of the most dangerous things you can do. Number 6. Percival P-74. The 1950s saw a huge leap forward in the world of aviation. The US and the Soviet Union were locked in their Cold War, and both sides pushed each other to the limits in terms of engineering and exploration. Unfortunately, though, the Percival P-74 doesn't quite fall into that category. This vintage helicopter is every bit as ugly as it was dangerous for the test pilots, all of whom hated getting into the cockpit. The fuselage was too bulky, the wheels were too small, and the tail rotor was out of proportion. The Percival P-74 doesn't look like anything we've seen in the skies in the last 5 decades, and for good reason. The rotors were driven with tip jets, which required 2 gas turbines, and the exhausts went right into the cabin. Couple that with the fact that the aircraft's engines were right under the belly, and the only way in or out of the cockpit is between the ducts, and you're looking at one dangerously hot ride. The Percival P-74 was in development for 5 years, and during that time no test pilot was ever able to get it off the ground. Thankfully for men in the cockpit, though, the project was scrapped and the aircraft needed to be wheeled off the airfield. Number 5. DeHavilland Comet. Despite winning, Britain was in shambles after World War II, and their aviation industry was worse for wear. So despite having an aircraft like the Supermarine once the war ended, there was no commercial or practical need for such a marvel. The Brits had to come up with something that would not only help improve their economy, but propel them into the future with the rest of the Western world. They created the world's first jet airliner, the DeHavilland Comet, and it officially entered service in 1952. And when you're making a passenger jet airliner, there's little room for error. But since the DeHavilland Comet made it to this list, you can bet there was one fatal design flaw. The cabin windows were made in a square shape instead of the circles and ovals that so many of us are used to seeing. That isn't a simple aesthetic choice. The square windows added more stress on the airframe than the rounded windows, and so while in flight, 3 different Comets broke apart. These horrific incidents managed to make global headlines, which Britain's jet airliner industry never fully recovered from. Number 4. CA-60 Nova Plano. Italy is definitely known for its sense of style. With cars like Maserati and Ferrari, it would seem like they've got the market cornered when it comes to looking good. But Italian aviation managed to make one huge mistake back in the 1920s, and we do mean huge. The CA-60 Nova Plano wasn't just an enormous flop, but it was downright dangerous to boot. The CA-60 Nova Plano was especially designed to fly 100 passengers across the Atlantic, but on its first and only flight, it proved that it was never going to make it that far, and it shouldn't be too hard to see why. This beast of an aircraft had 3 sets of 3 wings, for a grand total of 9 wings and 8 engines. You should be able to take one look at this thing and know she's never going to make it. But back in the 1920s, the prospect of flying across the Atlantic in the Nova Plano seemed like too good of an offer to ignore. The plane took off from Lake Maggiore in Italy and flew an embarrassing distance of 60 feet before crashing back into the lake. Number 3. Bell FM1 Erakuta. By now, it should be pretty clear that not every aircraft that took part in World War II was a winner. Being able to take the enemy head-on was important, but it was also important to think about the men who were actually operating the fighter. Case in point with the Bell FM1 Erakuta. I mean, the name might be cool, but being inside of this dangerous vintage aircraft was anything but. The aircraft manufacturer Bell created this FM1 model with the engines and guns in separate places on the aircraft to make for a better, more effective shooting strategy. But the FM1 Erakuta couldn't take the heat of battle. Literally, the engines would often overheat, leaving the crew in a tough spot when they're airborne. And while the guns may have been in a better position, the gunner station would fill with smoke, meaning whoever was inside couldn't see a thing, let alone breathe. And in the event that they needed to bail out of the fighter with their parachute, the rear propellers were blocking their escape. Number 2. The Devil's Hoverbike. Hoverboards may have been a great Christmas gift a few years ago, but scientists and engineers have been working on hovercrafts for decades before the more recent fad. And in the 1950s, the United States Army managed to cook something up that they thought would help during wartime. Enter the Devil's Hoverbike. The military thought it would be a good idea for their infantry to hover their way into battle using small one-man choppers. The idea of a battalion of hovering troops may seem like a goofy idea by today's standards, but this was cutting edge at the time. The biggest issue, however, with the aptly named Devil's Hoverbike is that the enormous rotor blades were placed just inches from the pilot's feet. One false move, one step in the wrong direction, and the pilot falls off of their tiny platform and into the horrifying rotator blades below, becoming minced meat. Number 1. Christmas Bullet. Last, and perhaps this time least, is quite possibly the worst plane ever built. For starters, it was built by a notorious con man, Dr. William Whitney Christmas. Named the Christmas Bullet, this aircraft was built as a biplane fighter that, instead of having your typical struts to support the wings, had wings that flapped like a bird. And as we've seen earlier on this list, that's never a good idea. The only thing that really worked for this aircraft was its fuselage, which isn't a great sign. Somehow, the prototype Christmas Bullet managed to get off the ground, but the wings would almost immediately twist off from the frame as if a sign from the universe that this was a momentously bad idea. But Dr. Christmas didn't care and went ahead with a second prototype, which made it far enough off the ground that the ensuing crash would kill the test pilot. Watch our Vehicles playlist for more top 15 videos about amazing vehicles. Sit back, relax, and binge watch all of our best vehicle videos.